Hi guys, today on Random Help, I'm going to talk about the history of education in the UK. I don't plan to make a long video on this, and if you want more details on the history of the UK education system, links are there in the description box below. So let's get to it. So the earliest school for Britain as a whole, so after the Roman civilization's gone, came around 600 AD. And during that time, it was a man named St. Augustine who brought about the sort of education system. This education system was primarily based around religion and teaching people about the religion and basic maths and things like and English and things like that. Later on in the years, they were more advanced, and independent schools started, grammar schools where they taught things like geometry, algebra, and all that kind of things. After that, they were more established, and higher education became more prominent. So it all started with Oxford, and some people then weren't particularly keen on Oxford and then moved to Cambridge, and Cambridge Institute started. Along the lines, the kings and queens and different colleges came about, where some became popular, like Eton, and and others, as time went on. So there were other independent schools that are given out, like Winchester, and as independent schools became more popular, more and more people wanted to get into public education, and more people were interested in education. And it was around the 14th century and things like 14th, 15th century, it became very popular that people wanted to get their children into education. Before, it wasn't a big deal, and then it started to become a big deal. Then during the 16th century, that's where there was the Renaissance period, and that's when education started to become more prominent. But other than education, apprenticeships became also quite popular. And this being the case, a lot of people didn't actually go to school but took an apprenticeship where they shadowed someone else, and through that people got their jobs, so like a blacksmith or something like that. So Henry VIII was actually quite prominent in terms of, so just before the Renaissance period, he was quite prominent in education, and a lot of schools were established. Around 400 schools were established for grammar. Some became state, but most of them were grammar schools, which were run by the church. As I said, it was quite important, even during Henry VIII period, that education was brought out by a religious perspective as well. So you'd have a very religious perspective, but you would still be learning on the basic maths and things like that. After Henry the Eighth, came the Renaissance period, where they learnt added things like Latin and Greek and Hebrew, which was added into the curriculum, and they had to learn it. During the Elizabethan period, that's when things got a bit more interesting. That's when a lot of the science and geometry and philosophy and arts all got very popular. So that's why you see a lot of these great artists around the Elizabethan period, and great scientists around the Elizabethan period, and slightly after and slightly before that. But it's around that time that things started booming. Well, that's the initial progression of education becoming such a big thing, is during the Elizabethan period, and because Elizabeth herself was quite interested in education. During the from the 17th and 18th centuries, that's when it became more recognizable in terms of the school curriculum, and it became more universal. It became an accepted form that everyone studies in this sort of way, and the government has a set structure. Before, there was no set structure, and now there is a set structure. So after all that has happened, we are now set around around the 18th century, 19th century era, where education is becoming more prominent and is more necessary. So the establishments such as grammar schools are already in place, and they're pretty popular for the rich and the wealthy. and the poor people don't get to do as much in terms of education. So there is no nationwide education for everyone. However, there is for the rich and wealthy that can afford to go and get an education. However, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, there were more the interest after the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution and things like that. Britain started to understand that there was a need for nationwide education, and people weren't getting an education lower down. Therefore, they had to implement some sort of nationwide education, which started to come into place. However, you know, even though that was put in place, it wasn't fully done well, and there were people that were still who were poor and could not go into an education because, but there were at least some sort of education where you get the basic skills of reading and writing. But in terms of higher education, it was still very hard for anyone to get in. So after the war, that's when it started to improve, and that's when there were more state schools put in, especially with the Labour government, and especially the Great Depression. Also, after the Cold War period, education became more prominent, and more people gave more money into the education system, because the Cold War was a big scandal, because the Britain and the US were in a rush to make the best sort of the best new minds to make the next new satellite, or against Russia. There was a competition between Russia and the UK and the USA to make the best, and to make the best of people. After the war, the education, no one really wanted to get an education. They just wanted to be with the families and just live, because life is short. After they seeing the war and seeing how easily life could be taken away, they were more inclined to not go to an education. But after the war, they were more inclined to get an education. And so during this Cold War period, after the World War, between Russia and Britain, because of this fight, Britain tended to put more investment into education, and over the time it sticked, and we were in pretty much getting more and more people becoming very science heavy and things like that. Also, another thing that changed was how strict it was in school. So around 1998, they banned all sort of hitting in schools. So before that, hitting was allowed, especially in private schools. There were people who would be whipping the children if they did something wrong. It was sort of negative conditioning, which shouldn't be seen as correct anyway, nowadays anyway. Over time, also, something happened to the universities as well. So universities used to be free because not many people used to go to university, and going for free and providing money. So the government used to provide money and give you a free education if you went to university. But obviously, back in that time, so as I said, not many people go to university, so that was something government could do. Now, because the jobs market has become more and more competitive, more and more people going to university, the government doesn't have enough money to provide for that. And so it went from the government paying something to free, to government subsidizing to around 3,000, to government paying nothing at all and giving it all out as loans. So there was a maintenance grant that used to be offered in universities that's not there anymore, and now it's all loan based. So it just shows how money is also a big key factor in education and people going into education, and things like that. But obviously, predominantly, there have been more and more state schools and private schools being made over the period of time from the 18th century. And however, even in this period of time, there is a key structure that is behind primary school and secondary school, and in the sixth form and A levels. But this is not the same case. This is not the same case in university, where it's more flexible on what sort of structure you have. It's depending on what degree you do, obviously. Because if you do something like law or medicine, you have some sort of a strict kind of course you have to follow. But with other degrees like chemistry, you can kind of pick and choose what modules you want to do. In terms of also another thing I need to mention is A levels did change. So A levels weren't always A levels. So A levels used to be something called O levels, and GCSE was not always GCSE. They used to have separate. So GCSE were not offered before. There was like a higher paper that only people that went to actual secondary grammar schools got it, but things like polytechnics were a thing during the 70s, that so where people would take an exam but it wouldn't like a some sort of diploma, but they would never be able to go to university or things like that. So that being the case, it showed that so now that's changed because grammar schools and state schools, they're trying to make an exam that was sort of both, and so they made this GCSE, which was a standard for the whole of the UK, and A levels is the same. It used to be O levels and A levels, where O level. Sorry, there used to be O levels, which was before GCSEs, which was O levels, and then it was GCSE. GCSE was the standard system now that everyone knew. And now there's A levels as well. A levels was there before, but it was much harder. Now it's made more. It was much harder initially. So before the 2000s and things, it was much harder, and then it became gradually easier as time went on. And A levels, so it was a modular course, and it was quite easy. People played the system. More and more people were getting A stars and things. And then now what they've done is changed it once again to a linear system, and they made it a bit harder, but the content tends to be a bit more usable and useful. So that's that. In terms of anything else in the I've mentioned it all about the UK education system here. So this was just a brief history of the UK education system. If you want more details on it, if I've not gone through it, then check in the links below, and you'll find out more. So that's all from me today. And I'll see you next time.